My name is Juliet Simone, and I am the National Health and Program Director here at Oasis. I don't do talks on a regular basis, but this has been a topic that's been of interest to me for quite some time, and I have a public health background. That's what the MPH is for, and so this has been something that's been of interest to me for a few years, and I did start standing myself at my own desk at the office maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, and I've never sat down since. So I really wanted to take a deeper dive into the research to see what physiological effects there were on a body, what the population health perspective of sitting versus standing versus moving was. So I hoped that other people would find it interesting as well, and I hope that you all enjoy this talk. So I thought it was a good thing to start with. Why is it called sitting is the new smoking? And you may have heard that phrase used around a little bit in the news or in any kind of articles. And I did not make that phrase up. Someone did, at best I could tell, about maybe 4 years ago. Really meant to be a comparison from a public health position. So I first wanted to start here by what these two things have in common. So so what we know now about smoking is that it was certainly a public health crisis that was really brought to light, in the mid 20th century, right? And now we know, but we didn't at the time, that there were, or that policy changes have changed the way that we view smoking. So, people do it less. We're not allowed to do it indoors at all anymore. And, most people can probably remember, back in the day when you could smoke on an airplane, in a movie theater, in a doctor's office. So policies have changed over the years and really changed and resulted in fewer smokers from a population level. So back in the 50s and 60s, about half of the American population were smokers, and now it's down to between about 20 to 25% of Americans. So there is something to say that societal policy changes can be very effective on a population scale. And so the way that might connect to sitting now is that it's becoming acknowledged as a public health problem. And so I think this started really being looked at in this way in the early 2000s. So it's still a very new concept looking at it from a population health problem. However, some businesses that have a lot of people who generally work behind computers as their primary, posture are looking at addressing this from a company-wide perspective. And so that's where I thought it was really interesting looking at it from a public health perspective. However, we're too early in this yet to know what any long-term interventions or policy changes might have on the effect of the health of a population. So that will be yet to be seen, but it'll be interesting over the next several decades to see what changes in this or what doesn't. But there are some crucial points to be made about what sitting and smoking do not have in common. So we know now, again, that the tobacco industry was quite a force to be reckoned with in the mid-20th century, and that they worked really hard to ensure that credible science was not seen to the public, and that they did a pretty good job discrediting science about the negative effects of smoking. Far as I could tell, there's no chair industry that has a powerful lobby in Washington that's making sure that we're all continuing to be seated. Also, something important to note, sitting isn't chemically addictive. We might argue that it's habitually addictive, but it's not chemically addictive. So those are two big points to be made about why comparing sitting and smoking are not relevant. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I have a public health degree, which really is a different perspective on health issues compared to someone who works as a clinician, a nurse, a doctor, what have you. So the public health perspective looks at populations, so not so much of what this person does or that person does, Public health practitioners never see sort of patients or clients on an individual level, but it looks at data, it looks at trends from a population perspective. And what population we're looking at depends on what question we're trying to answer. So we can look at adults 65 and over for certain questions to be answered. We can look at elementary school children for questions to be answered. We can look at and slice and dice a population any way that helps us get to the right answer. And it's public health professionals who care about monitoring and surveillance of data and thinking about promotion and prevention like vaccines and all of that. So that's just a little brief introduction on what public health is, but I am not a therapist. I'm not a nurse, so just want a disclaimer that I may not be able to answer. I probably won't be able to answer technical questions on physiology, but looking at big picture data and statistics and population perspective is where this conversation is going to be going. Here's a little outline of what we're going to look at today. I find it really helpful when you're addressing any health problem to take a little bit of a historical context to know how we got to where we're at today. And so I'm gonna take you through a journey going back to the Stone Age about how populations handle physical activity. We're going to talk a little bit about how occupations and moving within those occupations has changed over a couple thousand years. The shifting of a population in the US, a little bit more in depth about sedentary behavior, and then a little bit into the physiology of what happens to our bodies when we sit for long periods of time, because something happens. I'm going to go into the research about it, and then we never like to leave anybody here with a lot of information, especially if it's going to bum you out, without a plan to improve on something. But it's not anything that you're going to have to share with the class. It's just for your own information, and you get to work on that at your own time if you wish. So I went to primary research. I looked at medical journals, epidemiology journals, and really did a deep dive into to see what was out there, what research has already been done. And the take-home message from all of the studies that I found is that research studies have shown that sitting time is associated with increased risk of all-cause mortality, independent of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So I know that's kind of research terminology there, but really what that means is that people are at a greater risk of dying and of having diseases that isn't connected to exercise. So even if you exercise regularly, but you also sit a lot, the exercise doesn't necessarily undo all that sitting. And so I'm going to leave the research world here for just a minute, but I did want to kind of set the stage with that comment, and then we'll take a much deeper dive into that as we go along. So we're going to go in the Wayback Machine and talk about why we move less now than we once did. So what's kind of interesting is that it has been recognized for thousands and thousands of years that there is a connection between being physically active and being healthy. Long before there was anything like, research studies or, double-blind studies or anything like that, it was just common sense and pretty obvious to people that moving was healthy. And of course, life was just more physically engaging in the past, especially as it has been even in the 21st century. We've seen a lot of changes just in the last 18 years, let alone the last 200 or so. And then technology has changed how much energy and muscle and stamina that we use to do things that we do, for jobs, for survival, but also for leisure. And I'm using technology in the most broadest of terms here, including like stone tools. And we'll talk more about sort of the evolution of using tools a little bit too, but I do mean technology in the most broad sense. Something I found really interesting is that archaeologists found that before the Industrial Revolution, so in the 19th century, before then, of course, again, it was common sense or it makes sense to us that people were more active as part of daily survival, but also part of recreation. Now, I think that if I were working hard all day out in a field or grinding, wheat to make bread and washing clothes by hand, that when my chores were done, I'd want to kick my feet up and just take a nap. But apparently, it was still more commonplace to have active forms of recreation. So religious ceremonies, dances, cultural expressions that were all still much more active than we're used to now. Granted, they didn't have TV or Netflix, so maybe if they had that option, I'd like to think that people probably haven't changed that much over time. And if they had the option to watch Netflix, they probably would, but they didn't, so they danced instead. Going back to the agricultural revolution that was about 10,000 years ago, really made a big shift in how people live and move and interact with one another. So once people figured out that you could farm, people moved into communities. So instead of being, hunters, gatherers, more nomadic, moving from, cave dwelling to other dwelling, people were able to come together in what has become urban environments over many years. And so it's a natural, I think, evolution of how people interact with one another, that if you have now a band of people instead of your small family or your tribe moving together, that you might recognize things like, oh, well, Margaret's really good at making tools. So Margaret, why don't you just go ahead and make all the tools then? Virginia, you seem to be really good at sewing. Do you want to be the town seamstress? So, jobs became a little more specialized once we kind of settled down into communities. And so that changed from people really being a jack of all trades to some people being more specialized. But many people were still farmers in one sense or another. And this probably reduced some level of activity for some people that lived in these communities. But even in the agricultural revolution era, it was recognized that also, in addition to physical activity positively affecting health, that proper diet and nutrition were also needed to have a healthy life. And what's cool about this too is that this principle was really adopted across the planet. Before there was any communication between people who lived in India and people who lived in Scandinavia. Almost every culture had some acknowledgement that these principles of healthy eating and active lifestyles were a part of health. So here are just some ideas of the different jobs that have been available to humans over the course of time. And even really early, if you can call them public health practitioners, saw the difference in health among people that had more active jobs from a population level to people who had more sedentary jobs. So as I mentioned before, you can slice and dice populations depending on what question you're trying to answer. And so if you want to look at what jobs have healthier people and the jobs that don't, that's the population you can look at. So there was an Italian physician in the early 1700s that noticed there was a big difference in the health of people who were like on-foot messengers. So I put Hermes up there. He probably didn't look like that in real life, but he's moving around. And between tailors and cobblers. So yeah, they still might be, kind of using their upper body a lot, but it's kind of common sense, right? That they're not maybe like running with a message from town to town or whatever. So So making that connection between a population that's more active and a population that's more sedentary was made a long time ago. So as we moved along the agricultural revolution, yes, technologies were invented, things happened, we were, thrusting forward into the future. But it really wasn't until the Industrial Revolution during the majority of the 19th century that we saw a big enough shift in the way that we work and the way that we live to probably have a bigger effect on our health from a physical activity and sedentary standpoint. So there were a lot of amazing things, obviously, that came out of the Industrial Revolution. There were machines that were invented to stop people from doing a lot of monotonous and mundane labor, factories, mass production. And then what was kind of cool about that era too is that it came with some infrastructure ideas that didn't have to be invented before then. So the idea and infrastructure of transportation and communication and even banking really emerged in a meaningful way from the Industrial Revolution as a way to sort of manage this new way of living. I don't know if, they kind of say the Industrial Revolution ended in like the 1890s, but I don't really know what we're calling the 20th century. The technology revolution, I don't know, but I think sometimes we have to be into the future to know what we call the present. But we do certainly see that this is still changing and changing very rapidly as we're living today. So, these are arguments that have been made back in the Industrial Revolution that we're still hearing. Those robots took our jobs, right? The mechanization of physical jobs. I've heard that on the news this week, about robots filling Amazon packages instead of people doing it. And these robots are going to take our jobs. Well, that was an argument that was also made at any point in the Industrial Revolution. We think about the job of, little kids sweeping the streets to get all of the horse manure out of the street. Well, actually, okay, that's not a good example because that job literally doesn't exist anymore. But, okay, I'm all thinking of jobs now that don't exist anymore. But any kind of factory mass production, right? Humans used to do that stuff, and now they don't. So this isn't a new complaint of people. And turns out, this is a little bit of an editorial, but we've never run out of jobs, really. We just make more, then we need people to make the robots and think about how to make the robots. So it's changing, yes, and that can be scary and can produce a lot of anxiety, but we make more jobs. Certainly, and I was thinking about some things that have changed and that have even changed dramatically in the last several years. And I was thinking about cleaning floors. Probably, I don't have data to back this up, but probably for millennia, people swept with one sort of form of a broom or another. Maybe it was a little bit harder when the floors were dirt because there was a little added resistance, to using a broom against that kind of surface. And then sometime when was the vacuum invented? The 1920s, 1930s maybe, but probably not popularized until the 50s or even 60s maybe. So that changed the motion, right? But it's still an active chore. You're still moving around a little bit. But what's kind of the latest and greatest way to clean a floor? The Roomba. It's more than just a cat toy, right? Ever seen any of the videos where the little cat rides the Roomba? Oh, they're hysterical. Anyway, exactly. So, all we have to do for that is bend over and plug the stupid thing in or unplug it, right? So that's changing. So that is changing, even as we're living and breathing right now. I know that's a really light graph, but it's okay. The important thing is to look at the trend there. So another big element that has changed the way we move and live in the world is that just a few years ago, the world's population tipped from being mostly rural to mostly urban. And of course, we've been more rural in the United States for, don't quote me on this, maybe since the 50s or 60s, but on the global scale, that just shifted a couple years ago. So just think about the jobs that people have when you're living in more rural environments versus more urban. They're going to be different. And I wanted to take a little closer look at one particular occupation, farming. And I picked farming because, as I mentioned in a little bit of this historical perspective, it's something that almost every human literally and metaphorically had a hand in at some point up until maybe the 1830s, and still around the world today, but less than 50% probably now. But the way that farming has been an occupation and an industry in the United States has changed dramatically in most of our lifetimes. So I thought that was a worthwhile occupation to look into. So without repeating myself too much from before, the agricultural revolution had a lot to do with making farming more efficient. And so somewhere along the line, somebody realized that if you take the seeds of the thing that you like and you save those seeds for next year, you have a better crop. And you had more control instead of trying to gather, the seeds or the grain products or whatever, and then instead of maybe hunting, if you could corral some animals. Some animals were more docile than others. You could pick those animals and again have a little control over their microevolution, and then you had food ready to go. So some ancient genius ancestor of all of ours that was probably just one person, or probably all related to that one person, had this genius idea that farming was an efficient way to live a life. So that's, again, when all those communities evolved. And that's also when we saw the population of humanity really increase, because you can imagine how tough it would be to have more than one little kid if you're a hunter-gatherer and nomadic and moving around and trying to manage, you can't really manage a toddler and a baby on the hip. So once people stayed in settlements and villages and communities, the population of humanity was really able to accelerate. So here's a little range visually of some of the tools that have been used to farm over 10,000-ish years or so. And if we start in the upper left and go kind of down like we read a book, it goes from, really physically engaging all the way down to like, not so much. And of course there are people, who still have to hand pick tomatoes, but a bulk of farming now is done by these huge industrial machines that was once done by hand. But it didn't happen overnight. As technologies evolved, it went down from all by hand to using some animal power, and then creating and inventing technology like a horse-drawn plow. Still, you can imagine how much work that still must have been for somebody physically to manage, like all the core work to manage that that plow. But it's still pretty different than actually like thrashing, grains by hand. So to speak to a little bit of how efficient farming has become, certainly in the U.S. over the last 40 or 50 years, you can see here that the date on the far left here is 1800. When I say 40 or 50 years, it's really been a steady decline, as you can see by this trend. But it starts with the year 1800, ends with 2000. And it shows the total percent of U.S. jobs that were farming. And it goes from 90%, so again, most folks were farmers 200 years ago, down to 2.6 farming jobs are part of our overall occupations here in the U.S. And I also know this is impossible to read, but the point of it, I think, still is relevant to show. This graph shows the proportion of employment by occupation categories from just 1910 to 2000. And so the top two, you can see there's a dramatic difference between the black bars, which is 1910, and the gray bars that are 2000. And the top two are, professional jobs, technical jobs, and service workers. So probably not too surprising, right? We have a lot more, kind of intellectually driven jobs in those fields. And the bottom two, where you can see that those gray bars from the year 2000 are so small, they barely even register. Those bottom two are farmers and farm laborers. And the other ones, yes, there's a varying degree of difference, but those on those extreme ends are the most dramatic. The early 20th century started making connections between not just physical activity and health, but specific aspects of health. And once this research was done, then some other shifts in recommendations on a population health scale could start to be made. So it was the 1915 Surgeon General's report that was the first to report on that connection between diseases and inactivity. Now we remember from that Italian physician almost 200 years prior that connection was observed, but this was a little more of what we know as a modern sort of research approach with a report attached to it, with some meaning behind it. So and then in the 20s, researchers started to observe that not only was it unhealthy, but the death rates were connected to occupations with lower levels of physical activity, and that it works on a continuum. So it's not this binary, you either are healthy or not healthy, or you're active or you're not active, but there's everything in between. So in the late 1940s was kind of the modern era of research on health and disease state in connection to physical activity and physical inactivity. The late 1940s, there was a study that was done looking and that finally made that connection, as we all know so well now, that coronary heart disease was connected to physical activity or lack thereof. So we're still looking at this point at occupations and the population health of different occupations. So it's interesting that that's still one of the easiest sectors to slice and dice as we're trying to answer a question, as of people, what do they do most of the time? And it's an occupation. So this particular study looked at the differences between like bus conductors, not like symphony, but the bus conductors who, probably just, did this all day long, and they were, doing this, and I picture like holding this and doing that out the bus door or something, musicals, right? And then the person who was driving the bus. And lo and behold, they noticed a difference in their health. And you can probably guess which population was healthier. So this initial modern exercise research was done by a man named Jerry Morris and his research team. So if this is something that you're familiar with, that name will definitely come up, and I think his preliminary research is definitely still cited in modern research. I found myself hardly being able to do any kind of talk without having a slide like this in it, because I find it fascinating beyond belief, but it's the top 10 leading causes of death in 1900 and in 2010. And again, I know it's small, I'll explain, but you can see the proportions of the colors of the graphs. So on the left side, it's 1900. On the other side, it's 2010. And you can see, first of all, one of the aspects of this that's really stunning is that the graph itself is smaller. And that's just looking at death rates. So we're living longer. We're dying. Everybody dies all the time. So 100% of people die 100% of the time. But the rate of which they're dying has changed over time. So the top 3 causes of death in 1900 were, can anyone just take a guess?
Tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis, yes, number 2. Pneumonia, flu, number 1. And number 3 are gastrointestinal infections. So what do those 3 things have in common? They're communicable, right? We catch them from each other. They happen from, tight living spaces, bad hygiene, bad sanitation. Anyone know what the top 3 leading causes of death are right now in the U.S.? Heart disease, cancer. And then surprisingly, it used to be stroke up until recently. And when I made sure that my data were updated, it's now like the upper respiratory infections isn't the right word, but diseases like COPD and other of those diseases. But it has been stroke. So that's shifted, right? What do those have in common generally? Not the pathophysiology, but they're chronic, right? They're not communicable, they're not infectious. We each have our own disease state to get to one of those, except for a few environmental causes of cancer, of course. But generally speaking, we don't catch them from person to person. And so this giant shift over just 100 years, and again, think about the scope of the agricultural revolution and then the Stone Age before then. 100 years is a sliver of time, even for humans that haven't been around all that long. So the main causes of those, that shift, is to good public health practice. Sewage systems, something as simple that we generally take for granted here, had an enormous impact on the health of a population, and especially in urban areas. Living conditions, you think about some of those old pictures of the tenements in like the Lower East Side in Manhattan, back in the 19-teens and 20s, and there were 30 people living in a tiny one-room apartment. Well, imagine if one of those people had the flu. I mean, forget about it. All 29 other people that they lived with probably got the flu. So, and then, safety, industry standards, all of those things have really made a gigantic impact on the health of a population. So we're not dying from those things anymore, which is a triumph, a medical triumph. But now we have to look at the other things that we're dying from. And yes, we do all have to die from something, but it's still worth looking at to make sure that we're living better as long as we can, and hopefully increasing the life expectancy still. So even if the life expectancy shifts from 76 to 86, we might still be generally dying from these top three things, but maybe we're healthier over the span of our years and still dying of them hopefully further down the line. These are the same data parsed out by different infections to show, again, that point that I just highlighted. So this just shows the mortality from infectious diseases between 1900 and 2010. So get your flu shot, everyone. Immunizations are an enormous part of this triumph as well. And then conversely, this is heart disease and cancer. So all of those things that we just mentioned contribute to the shifting of those populations and causes of death. But there's a little more to it than that, than just the sanitation, than just the penicillin. And that has to do with some life expectancy. So some of these go parallel, right? Like one can't have happened without the other. But the life expectancy has been increasing since probably forever, but dramatically since 1900. And it's due to a lot of those better public health practices, better medicine, of course. Can you imagine what surgery was like 150 years ago? Like, no thanks. So yes, there's a lot of advances in all kinds of technology and medicine. But we've been on a steady incline for a long time here.